For the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with the congressmen who have been leading voices on defending Christians in Egypt, as well as the region as a whole, as well as joining my esteemed colleagues and friends who've been tireless advocates on that issue for many years now, and whose voices in the public square have really contributed in elevating the topic and the discussion about Copts in Egypt. You asked me to give a grade for the President Sisi's performance, and of course, anyone who teaches hates nothing more than giving grades. It also depends, of course, on whether we're grading on a curve or not, whether it's in comparison to previous performances by Egypt's president, or just how Sisi has behaved. But before I provide a grade and an assessment of the Sisi administration, of Congress's work, and of the Trump administration, I think we need to define what the metrics are. What are we grading him on? And of course, the Egyptian regime is not the only actor when it comes to discrimination in Egypt or the persecution of Copts. There are Islamist actors, there's the broader society and its action. But the role that the government plays, I think, is in 5 key areas. The first, as the commissioner mentioned, is that of the church building law. The church building law came, or was long awaited, for many years by the Copts. The Mubarak regime had promised it, the Morsi regime, even the military when it ruled before Morsi, and finally Sisi. When the law came out, I think it was a disappointment to many people, and we've seen the results of that today. The positive side of the law was this promise to legalize the situation of pre-existing churches that were there in the country that did not have any legal framework, although they were functioning and operating. On that regard, as was mentioned, only 1,800 applications have been approved, about 1,050 something of churches, and the rest of church-associated buildings. With this pace, we're looking at a 10-year, even more, until they finally legalize these churches. The negative aspect of the law was that it made the building of new churches in Egypt much harder. Kurt has spoken about the approval of new churches, or the building of new churches in those new communities in the desert. And of course, the government, as he pointed out, has welcomed doing this. But under President Sisi, in all these years, there's been one single church that has been approved in one of Egypt's existing villages. And that's the church that was built for the martyrs of Libya. And it gives us an example of the problem here, because here you have ISIS killing Copts in Libya. You have the president of Egypt promising to build a church to honor those martyrs in that village where they came from, Al-Ur. And then the reaction of the mob refusing to allow the church to be built inside their village, attacking the homes of the very families that lost their loved ones at the hands of ISIS in Libya, and then a reconciliation session that, instead of forces those people to accept that Christians can have a church in their village, agrees to their demand of moving the church, which is a magnificent building that has been built now, but moving it to the outskirts of the village, that it wouldn't be in their midst. So on the issue of church building, I think President Sisi would get a C at best for his performance on that regard. The second issue is that of appointments. We've seen, as the commissioner mentioned, a lot of very important steps that have been taken in terms of appointing 2 governors, Christian governors. This is not the first time Mubarak appointed one, but it's still a welcome step that was taken, as well as even at lesser levels in terms of local government. We've had a few Christians appointed in positions of deputy governor, of mayors, of overlooking local areas. So I think there has been some significant improvement in that regard. Obviously, the percentage of Christians has increased in parliament due to the law requiring a quota for Christians, as well as other groups, women and Egyptians abroad and others in parliament. But On other levels of appointments, we haven't seen any movement. There are still sectors of the Egyptian state that are completely closed to Copts. The percentage of Copts in the intelligence service is 0%. There isn't a single one allowed. The percentage of Copts in the state security, Amn Watani or Amn Dawla, is again 0%. They're not trusted, and that sends a message. The percentage of Copts in the foreign service, ranks of ambassadors and others, in terms of the judiciary, in terms of government companies, which continue to be a major sector of the Egyptian economy. All of these are very low numbers that do not reflect the reality of Coptic representation in Egypt. So the positive steps there would probably get him a B, although there's still a lot of things to be done there. Similarly, education, the educational system has been one often that excludes Copts in terms of teaching their history. Egyptian history is, of course, a simple line. The pharaohs, Alexander the Great comes, the Romans, and then there's this gap in history where absolutely nothing basically happened until the Arabs and Muslims came. And even under the Arab-Muslim rule, Copts continued to constitute the majority for a number of centuries. And again, anything about them is not there. So the question of the Coptic representation in the educational system, not just writing a few messages about national unity and toleration, but the reality of explaining to Egyptian kids the contributions of Copts to Egyptian history throughout Egypt's history is still lacking. We've seen some improvement there. It was mentioned the Minister of Education has taken important steps in terms of toleration in those educational material and others, but still the coverage of the Coptic history of Egypt is lacking. And that, of course, allows people to form all kinds of imaginary things about the people that share with them the same country. Kurt mentioned an attack on a church that led to the Maspero massacre in 2011. A couple of months earlier, there was an attack on another church in Giza, and the accusation toward the Copts there was that they were engaged in magic. They were doing black magic against Muslims, and for proof, they pointed out to texts that, surprise, surprise, was written in Coptic. So this lack of knowledge about the very contribution, any basic stuff about Copts is extremely problematic, although the steps in terms of reforming the educational system are, of course, welcome. Then we have the fourth area is that of the legal framework. We've had some improvement in terms of courts ruling in favor of Coptic women in receiving equal inheritance and not having Islamic Sharia applied to them, although we are still not sure about how universal those verdicts are going to be applied, whether they are limited to the case that was in front of the court, but the regime has taken no step in that regard. The regime has also not taken any serious step in terms of an anti-discrimination law that actually is applied on the ground, or in terms of dealing with the blasphemy law that is unequally applied to religious minorities. And it's the Copts, the Shia, the Quranists, and these Baha'is, these groups that suffer 99% of those cases revolving the blasphemy law. The last area, and probably the most important area, is how the government deals with sectarian attacks. And in that regard, I think Sisi receives a very clear F, a complete failure by the government. For the past 50 years, we have had the same thing happening over and over again, with the government somehow expecting that the results will change, although it every time does the same steps again. We have an attack that the police refuses to intervene to stop, although most of the times they are informed beforehand about the attack taking place. We have then the arrest of an equal number of Christians and Muslims to force a reconciliation session. We have a reconciliation session that gives the mob most of its demands, whether they want to kick people out of the village, whether they want the church to be outside of the village, whether they want a church that doesn't have a dome or a tower or a bell, all of these demands that they put. And the end result is not a single person in the past 50 years in over 1,000 attacks, sectarian mob attacks from 1970 until today, not a single person has been convicted, has spent time in jail for attacking Christians. The government is all happy to pass verdicts, all kinds of verdicts, death sentences on ISIS terrorists, on Muslim Brotherhood members who attack the churches, because these are the enemies of the government anyway. But when it comes to the mob attacks, we've had a complete failure by the government, creating not a culture of impunity, but a culture of encouragement. You can go out, attack the Copts, and your demands are going to be met by the government, and you're not going to get any punishment for it. Why not do it? It's really encouraging people by this government behavior to continue in the same path. Of course, President Sisi has, as a person, been perhaps the most outreaching towards the Copts in Egypt. He's been someone that I think has not shown any sign of intolerance towards them. He's always spoken positively about the Copts, and I think he really appreciates the Copts, the Coptic Pope, especially the fact that the Copts did not look for any foreign help after those significant attacks on the churches in Egypt at the hands of Muslim Brotherhood supporters in 2013. In his eyes, in a sense, the Copts proved their patriotism by not looking for any outside help. And he has, of course, taken also some symbolic steps in terms of going to church, of course, only on Christmas, never on Easter. Islam recognizes Christ's birth, but not his crucifixion or resurrection. But these are important things, and it matters when the president speaks in positive terms about the Copts in Egypt, in sending a message throughout the bureaucracy, the Egyptian state, that yes, these are equal Egyptians, as he always speaks about them. So the overall record is mixed. There are some areas that have had improvement. Personally, his rhetoric has been very positive, but are also significant areas where the problem has persisted and the situation has continued to worsen on the ground. When it comes to the Trump administration, I think it's also a mixed record. We've had religious freedom become a key component of the administration's foreign policy, of speaking about it internationally. But when it came convening the ministerial, other steps a lot that have really put religious freedom there at the center of the agenda. However, when it came to Egypt, I think we've had an attitude of accepting the Egyptian regime's policies towards Copts as the best that can be. They're not as bad as Mubarak, and they're certainly much better than the alternatives of the Muslim Brotherhood or other groups. So in that regard, the Egyptian regime has received a kind of green light or a kind of approval to continue with its policies, and with praise from the administration coming for such steps as the symbolic building of the biggest cathedral in the Middle East, or whatever they call it. It actually isn't, but all of these steps that have resulted in tweets and visits. Secretary Pompeo went there. I think actually that church symbolizes a lot of the problem in Egypt. It's built in the desert, but you still can't pray inside the cities. It's built for no one. And it's named by the Egyptian president. I mean, there isn't a single Coptic church in the world that is named the Birth of Christ Church. The president chose that name. We as Copts, we name our churches after our saints. We don't name them of nativity or anything like that. So it's a telling thing that even the name of that cathedral was chosen by the Egyptian president. Trump has also, I think, should be praised in some of the outreach or things that he's done with the Coptic American community, the presidential letters on the Global Coptic Day. These things were symbolic and made Copts, especially in the United States, feel that their contribution to the United States has been appreciated, and that they're part of the American political landscape. Congress, of course, has been much better than the administration, in my view, in terms of dealing with the Coptic issue. Resolution 49, I think, has been probably the most significant piece of legislation that has been done on the Copts, for a very long time. And it's not just that the resolution is there, that there are things written in it. The specific areas that it has called for action on, I think, are important to highlight. It mentioned education and the need for educational reform. It talked about equality and how Copts should be granted legal equality in the country. And it also talked about this culture of impunity, this need to deal with the reconciliation sessions. So it was, I think, a positive thing that the resolution was there, the language that it had, the number of sponsors that it has received. Unfortunately, the resolution was obviously not passed during the last Congress's session. Hopefully, I'm happy to hear that the resolution will be reintroduced, and hopefully some action can be taken in that regard. I don't know how I'm doing with time, but to end with the Biden administration, I think there's a risk that many advocates of religious freedom fear that the new administration will sideline religious freedom, that due to the centrality of the topic under the Pompeo State Department, the issue will be sidelined and ignored. And I think that would be a really bad thing, not just because it affects real people on the ground and their lives, but because religious freedom shouldn't be a partisan issue. There's nothing about it that should be just a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. On the other hand, I think we're going to see more pressure on Egypt regarding human rights in general. President-elect Biden has already, even as a candidate, tweeted about some of these cases before. He's talked about it. I think there'll be some interest in pressuring Egypt on human rights issues, and hopefully religious freedom wouldn't be completely ignored under that package, and some steps would be taken, especially, again, on that issue where we continue to see no action by the Egyptian regime. And that's the reality of the attacks and the lack of punishment, creating this culture of impunity and of encouragement. Thank you.